A single man stands before a throne that has sat empty for 1,000 years. This is the silent throne room of Minas Tirith, and the man is Lord Cirion, Steward of Gondor. His hand rests on the cold, unyielding stone, a seat of power that holds no warmth, no life. For centuries, his line has ruled from this isolated height, governing through rigid decrees and the lingering fear of a king who may never return. This choice, to wield power from a distance, has hollowed out the kingdom's heart and stilled the voices of its people. A deep and dangerous silence now blankets the land, a quiet so profound it threatens to consume everything, even as faint whispers tell of a shadow stirring in the east. By the end of this tale, you will understand the true cost of power without presence, and how even the mightiest fortress can fall from within. What does it take for a leader to truly hear the people they are meant to serve? I'm curious to know where in the world you're listening from right now, and what the local time is for you. Lord Cirion sent his finest captain, Borondir, riding north into the quiet province of Inorian. The grain shipments had stopped coming, and the messenger ravens had ceased their flights. This was not the clamor of rebellion Borndir expected to find. He rode into villages where the people simply watched him pass, their eyes hollow, their tools lying idle. They offered no defiance, only a weary resignation. When he asked why the tribute had not been sent, an elder merely gestured toward the southern horizon, toward the distant white peak of the city. "Why strain our backs for a king who does not see us?" he asked. "Why send our grain to a throne that sends back only silence?" The problem was not malice, but a profound and chilling indifference. These people had not forgotten their rulers. They had simply given up on them. Borndir faced a commander's hardest duty, to carry back a report that held no glory, only a mirror to a failing state. He returned to the White City and told his steward the plain, unsettling truth. It was not an enemy host that threatened Gondor, but a creeping void where loyalty once lived. And in that moment, as Cirion heard the words, the first cold seed of doubt took root in his mind, whispering that a throne's true power does not lie in its stone, but in the answered cries of its people. The report from Inorian was a poison, slow and subtle, working its way through the veins of the citadel. Cirion called his council in the high chamber, the stone walls echoing with a hollow grandeur. Borndir stood before the assembled lords and captains, his words painting a picture not of rebellion, but of a land falling into a deep and silent sleep. He spoke of fields untended and hope extinguished, yet the steward heard only a challenge to his authority. He did not see the sickness Borndir described. He saw only a symptom of insufficient control. His answer was not to listen, but to command. He decreed a doubling of the royal patrols and a stricter enforcement of tax collection under the ancient statutes. "We will remind them of the law," he declared, his voice ringing with a certainty the room could no longer share. This was the illusion he clung to, the belief that power was a thing to be imposed from above, a set of chains that could bind a people's spirit. The order was a wall, built not to protect the kingdom, but to shield the steward from a truth he refused to face. Around the table, the few lords who still possessed clear eyes exchanged uneasy glances. One, a grizzled commander named Baronir, dared to speak. "My lord," he began, his voice heavy with the weight of his years, Fear may secure obedience, but it cannot cultivate loyalty. What good are patrols in a land where the people have already turned away? Cirion's gaze was cold, a final door closing. The law is the foundation of order, he stated, and I am its steward. The council ended not in agreement, but in a fractured silence. The chasm that Borndir had witnessed in the villages had now cracked open the very floor of the throne room. Loyalists who had served the line of stewards for generations now whispered in the torch-lit corridors, their faith shaken. They saw a leader treating his own people as the enemy, and in doing so, he was making that fear a reality. Far to the east, in the dark fastness of Mordor, a sleepless eye perceived this new discord not as a sound, but as a vibration in the very air, a weakness in the foundation of the White City. The shadow began to stir, not with the clamor of armies, but with the patient, chilling knowledge that a kingdom divided against itself cannot stand. The orders from the White City felt like a cold stone in Borndir's gut. He could not sit idle while the kingdom frayed at its edges, so he took a small, unmarked boat and let the current of the great river Anduin carry him south. The journey was a descent into silence. Where once the waterway had been a bustling artery of trade, he now found only stillness. The docks at Pelargir were half empty, the great merchant cogs sitting at anchor with their sails furled, their timbers groaning with disuse. He pushed further, to the very delta where the river meets the sea, the Aether Anduin. Here, among the raid cutters and fisher folk, he heard the new name for their despair. They called it the Grey Tide, a slow, suffocating wave of apathy, they said flowed not from any enemy land, but from the heart of Gondor itself. It was a silence that choked the will from a man, making the very effort of mending a net or setting a sail feel pointless. One evening, drawn by the sound of quiet weeping from a small hut built on stilts, Borondir found an old fisherman mourning his son, lost at sea weeks before. The steward's law offered no comfort for such a loss, only a notation in a ledger. Setting aside his rank and his weapons, Borondir did what no lord of the citadel had done in living memory. He stepped inside, sat on the rough-hewn floor, and shared their meager meal of fish and river grass. He spoke not of taxes or patrols, but of stories. He told the grieving family of the great fleets that had once sailed from that very delta, their sails like white clouds, their prows carving through waves to lands of wonder and alliance. He spoke of kings who walked among the people, who knew their names and shared their burdens. It was a small act, a single flame in a vast darkness, but to that family, it was everything. It was a reminder that they were not forgotten, that they were still part of something greater than their own sorrow. A flicker of long-dead pride kindled in the old fisherman's eyes. This simple humanity was Borondir's true defiance, a quiet rebellion against the throne's cold isolation. He did not know that his compassion had been noted. From the shadows of the reeds, a swift boat manned by the steward's spies slipped away, carrying word back to Minas Tirith that the captain was sowing seeds of hope, a crime that the Hollow Throne would not forgive. High in the citadel, a different kind of silence was being broken. While her father fortified his solitude, his daughter Finduilas moved through the torch-lit corridors of the royal archive. The air was thick with the scent of aged parchment and dust, a tomb for forgotten words. She was not meant to be here, not since her father had sealed the deeper chambers, declaring the past a distraction from the present crisis. But the present felt like a slow death, and Finduilas believed the cure lay buried in this very dust. Her fingers, delicate but determined, traced the spines of crumbling ledgers and brittle scrolls, searching for a whisper of wisdom in the echoes of her ancestors. She was not looking for battle strategies or tax records. She sought the ghost of the kingdom's soul. Late one night, her persistence was rewarded. Behind a loose stone she had discovered as a child, she found a sealed cylinder of Lebethran wood, untouched for generations. Inside was a single scroll, its script flowing and elegant, a chronicle from the reign of Steward Belechthir II. It was not a record of war or law, but of journey. It detailed how Belechthir, in the long years of the watchful peace, had refused to be a prisoner of his own throne. The scroll mapped his annual progress through the realm, his travels to every major fiefdom, and countless villages in between. He sat in their halls at Reed and broke bread with their farmers. He listened to their grievances under open skies and settled disputes not with distant decrees, but with a wisdom earned from seeing their lives firsthand. The king's peace was not a legend to be feared, the scroll concluded, but a presence to be felt. Finduilas sat back, the parchment trembling in her hands. This was the answer, and it was a devastating one. Her father's entire philosophy of rule, his belief in control through isolation, was a betrayal of this foundational duty. The throne was not a peak to rule from, but a seat to rise from in service. The cold truth settled in her heart. She now held a historical truth that condemned her father's reign. To speak it was to risk his fury and her own place in the court she loved, but to stay silent was to condemn Gondor to the gray tide her father could not see. The scroll was not just a relic, it was a choice, laid bare in the flickering candlelight, demanding her courage. A low, dissonant hum began to permeate the very stones of the White Tower. It was a sound felt more than heard, a vibration that traveled up through the marble floors and into the bones of those who walked the halls. For most servants and foreign dignitaries, the citadel was as silent as ever. But for the few guards with the old Númenórean lineage in their veins, the sensation was a constant, unsettling presence, a wrong note in the symphony of the city. They spoke of it in hushed tones in the guardrooms, of a deep thrumming that made their teeth ache and their sleep restless, a lament from the heart of the mountain itself. When the reports finally reached the steward's court, Cirion received them with cold impatience. He summoned the master masons and architects, commanding them to scour the tower's foundations for cracks or shifts in the stonework. For days, they tapped on walls and measured pillars, only to return with empty hands and baffled expressions. There was no structural flaw, no physical reason for the sound. To Cirion, this was proof. It was mere superstition, the frayed nerves of men spooked by shadows. He dismissed them all with a wave of his hand, declaring the matter closed. In his refusal to look deeper, he committed his gravest error yet. He was deaf to the truth that the tower was not crumbling, but grieving. It was a spiritual decay, the ancient magic that once bound the kingdom together, now weeping for its absent king and its isolated steward. While her father fortified his rational disdain, Finduilas felt the hum as a physical pain in her chest, a cold knot of dread that tightened with each passing day. She alone understood it was not a fault in the stone, but a warning cry from the soul of Gondor itself, a final plea to be heard before the silence became eternal. He arrived at the great gate with the dust of the northern wilds upon his cloak. He gave his name as Thorongil, a captain of the rangers, and offered his sword to the service of the steward. His eyes held a light and a depth that were uncommon in the White City, a weight of years that seemed at odds with his vigorous bearing. Lord Cirion received him in the throne room with a cold and measured courtesy. The steward saw not a potential ally, but a variable he could not control, a man whose loyalty was not bound by the ancient oaths that held his own lords. Pride and a deep-seated fear of any influence beyond his own dictated his decision. He accepted Thorongil's service, but granted him only a minor post, a captaincy of a remote garrison, with strict orders to remain within its bounds. It was a deliberate act of containment, a way to harness the man's obvious skill without ever having to truly hear his voice. Yet a man like Thorongil could not be so easily caged. His presence was a quiet stone dropped into the stagnant pond of the citadel's hierarchy. He did not command with bluster or demand respect with titles. He earned it through quiet competence and a startling foresight. In the mess halls, he spoke of patterns of smoke on the eastern horizon that spoke of orc movements, of shifts in the river currents that could warn of coming floods, knowledge that the city's insulated commanders had long forgotten. His words carried the chill wind of a wider world, a world the steward had tried to wall out. Two people in particular found themselves drawn to this quiet storm. For Borndir, returned from the south and chafing under the steward's suspicion, Thorongil was a living echo of the kings from the old scrolls, a leader who understood that authority was forged in the field, not decreed from a throne. He sought the Rangers' council, sharing his own grim reports from the provinces, and found in Thorongil a man who listened not to judge, but to understand. For Finduilas, watching from the high arches of the palace, Thorongil was the embodiment of the truth she had found in the archives. Here was a man who moved through the world, who gathered its wisdom firsthand. His very existence was a challenge to her father's isolation, a proof that the throne's power withered when it refused to look beyond its own walls. Cirion, from his cold height, saw only that his most loyal captain and his own daughter were looking to this outsider, and his fear curdled into a colder resentment. He had placed a wall around the ranger, but he could not stop the ideas from seeping through the cracks, ideas that were beginning to quietly reshape the hearts of those who still cared for Gondor's soul. The low hum in the stones found an answer in the quiet conversations held in the city's forgotten corners. In a dusty armory long fallen from use, Thorongil gathered his small band, a gathering some had begun to call the Grey Company. Borndir was there, along with a handful of guards whose loyalty had shifted from the throne to the people, and a few merchants who remembered a time when trade flowed freely. They spoke in hushed tones, not of treason, but of life. Thorongil told them of the wooded realm of the elves, where Lord Elrond's wisdom was not locked in a high hall, but shared in open council under the stars. He spoke of the horse lords of Rohan, whose king could be found mending a fence or riding with the herds, his strength measured by his connection to his land and his people. These were not fantasies. They were living proofs that a ruler's presence was the very breath of a nation, The stories painted a picture of a different kind of power, one that grew from the ground up, not down from an isolated peak. The question hanging in the dusty air was simple and devastating. What could they do, here and now, to make that truth visible? The answer was not a grand speech or a defiant proclamation. It was a fountain, in the first circle of the city, where the common folk lived and toiled. A public wellspring had collapsed years ago, its stones scattered, its waters silenced. The steward's court had noted its disrepair in a ledger and done nothing. To the Grey Company, it was a perfect symbol of the throne's neglect. Their plan was a quiet rebellion of mortar and effort. On a day when the Citadel's attention was turned inward, they gathered with tools instead of weapons. They worked through the daylight hours, Borndir and the guards hauling stone, the merchants providing food and drink, and Thorongil working alongside them, his hands as skilled with trowel and level as they were with sword. They did not speak of the steward or the law. They simply worked, rebuilding what was broken. The reaction from the people was not immediate. At first, they watched from their doorways with the same hollow suspicion they had shown Borndir in Inorian. But as the fountain took shape, as the clear water began to flow again, their silence broke. Children laughed at the splashing water. Women came to fill their buckets without a long, weary climb. An old man wept, remembering the sound from his childhood. It was a small thing, a single fountain, but its restoration was a language everyone understood. It said, "You are seen, you are worth the effort." The gratitude that flowed from the people was a palpable force, a warmth that had been absent from the city for a generation. But this light could not be hidden. From the high walls, the steward's loyalists watched the gathering, the work, the undeniable connection forming between the ranger and the populace. A report was swiftly carried to Cirion. His captain and this outsider were not just repairing stone, they were mending the people's faith, and in the eyes of a hollow throne, that was the most dangerous act of all. The stakes of their quiet rebellion were no longer about a symbol, they were about survival. The restored fountain's murmur was a quiet revolution, but Finduilas knew its language could be drowned out by a single decree from her father. She needed to make the old truth she had found in the scrolls visible, to stage a living memory of what Gondor had been. Her weapon would be a feast. Using her authority as the steward's daughter, she commanded the great hall be opened, a space usually reserved for state functions and silent, formal audiences. The invitations she sent, however, broke with centuries of tradition. They went not only to the high-born lords and captains, but to the master stonemason who had helped rebuild the fountain, to the weavers from the first circle, and to the farmers from the Pelennor fields whose hands were still stained with earth. She was modeling the inclusive courts of her ancestors, creating a stage where the kingdom's disparate parts could, for one night, remember they were one body. Lord Cirion was furious. He saw it as a dangerous frivolity, a blurring of necessary boundaries that bordered on insurrection. He declared he would have no part in it, that she had overstepped, and he retreated to his private chambers as the hall below began to fill with unaccustomed sound. Yet, as the music and the distant hum of conversation drifted up through the stone, a strange restlessness took hold of him. The silence of his own rooms became suffocating. Driven by a compulsion he could not name, a flicker of the king he was meant to serve, He descended at the last moment. The sight that greeted him from the doorway was one from the old scrolls come to life. The hall was a tapestry of color and noise. A farmer was explaining the turn of the seasons to a captivated noble, his rough hands gesturing broadly. A guardsman shared a toast with a silk merchant. For a fleeting instant, the weight on Cirian's shoulders felt lighter, the ghost of a true king's duty stirring in his heart. But the moment he stepped into the light, the spell fractured. His presence was a winter frost. The music faltered. The easy conversation stilled into a respectful, fearful hush. He did not know how to move among them. He stood apart, a statue of authority, his greetings stiff and formal, his eyes looking past the faces of his people to some distant point of protocol. He was trying to perform a duty he had only ever read about, and his awkward, distant demeanor underscored the very isolation he was meant to overcome. The guests bowed low, their earlier ease replaced by a familiar wariness. They saw a man trapped by his own throne, a ruler who had come down from the mountain, but had brought the cold with him. The evening ended with a profound and complicated ache in the air, a glimpse of what could be, married to the crushing reality of what was. Hope and disappointment now lived in the same room, and the distance between them felt like the longest league in Middle-earth. The dissonant hum in the white stone was now a scream on the wind. High on the peaks of the Erd Nimrise, the beacon fires of Gondor had failed. The chain of light, that ancient call to arms meant to flash from summit to summit, had broken. A watchman brought the news to the throne room, his voice trembling not with fear of the enemy, but with the dread of delivering such a failure. The fire at Eilenak had not been answered by Nardal. The silence in the mountains was a louder alarm than any war horn. Lord Syrian received the report, as he did all others, as a problem of logistics and discipline. He saw no metaphor in the unlit peaks, no connection between the extinguished fires and the extinguished hope in his people. His command was swift, cold, and utterly predictable. He ordered a full military review of the beacon keepers, a bureaucratic inquest to root out the negligence. He would dispatch scrolls and officers from the safety of his citadel, believing the weight of his command could be carried on parchment. It was the perfect, tragic expression of his reign, an attempt to solve a crisis of spirit with a checklist. The review would take weeks, and its only outcome would be a list of names to punish, long after the shadow had grown stronger. The true cause was the same gray-tide Borndir had witnessed in the south, the same despair Finduilas had felt in the feast hall. The men who tended those lonely, wind-scoured posts had simply given up. Why keep a fire for a king who saw no further than his own walls? Why maintain a signal for a kingdom that felt already lost? While the steward's clerks sharpened their quills, Thorongil found Borndir in the courtyard. The ranger's eyes were on the dark line of the mountains. He did not speak of reviews or regulations. He spoke of a single fire, and the message its lonely flame would send. That very night, without orders or official sanction, the two captains took the steep, hidden paths out of the city. They rode not as lords of Gondor, but as shadows against the moonlit stone, their mission an act of profound defiance. To reach the nearest beacon of Amon was a hard night's ride, but they pushed their horses, driven by an urgency the throne could not comprehend. They found the post abandoned, the woodpile dry and scattered, the hearth cold. Without a word, they set to work. Borndir, with his soldiers' strength, gathered and stacked the timber. Thorongil, with the skill of a ranger who knew the value of a single spark in a vast darkness, lit the tinder. The flame caught, hesitant at first, then leaping upward into a proud, golden blaze. It was a small fire on a single hill, but its light was a shout in the silent night. It was a promise that someone was still watching, that someone still cared enough to act. That lone, defiant flame did more to rekindle the loyalty of the beacon keepers than any scroll from the citadel ever could. But in the east, the Dark Lord's gaze shifted. He had counted on the blindness of the steward, the slow decay of the realm. This single, swift, unauthorized act of light was a variable his plans had not accounted for. It signaled that a new will was stirring in Gondor, one that moved faster than bureaucracy and burned brighter than fear. The lone fire on Amon was a question, and Borndir intended to provide an answer. If a single flame could challenge the silence, what power lay in a symbol of unity, forgotten by all but the dust? He gathered his volunteers not in the citadel's shadow, but by the newly flowing fountain, their faces lit by resolve, not torchlight. Their goal was the dead city of Osgiliath, the ancient capital straddling the Anduin. There, in the crumbled husk of the great council hall, lay the speaking stone, a massive, smooth slab around which the kings of old had gathered with their people to debate and govern. To bring it back would be to rebuild more than a monument. It would be to resurrect the very idea of a Gondor that listened. The journey down the river was a passage into memory itself. The broken towers of Osgiliath stood like shattered teeth against the sky, a stark testament to a glory that proximity to its people had once forged, and that isolation had ultimately lost. The silence here was different from the citadels, thick with ghosts and the slow, grinding work of decay. They found the council chamber open to the sky, its floor a carpet of weeds and fallen masonry. And there it was, the stone, half buried but seemingly untouched by the centuries, its surface still holding a faint, polished sheen. As they worked to free it, the first black arrow thudded into the stone beside Borndir's head. The ambush was not chance. It was a calculated strike. Orcs, sent from the shadow in the east, poured from the surrounding ruins. They had not come to pillage the dead city, but to prevent this specific act of remembrance. The skirmish was a brutal, close-quarters affair of clanging steel and guttural cries in the skeletal hall. Borndir fought with the desperation of a man defending a future he could only just glimpse. When a hulking orc broke through their line, its scimitar aimed for a young volunteer, struggling with the stone's weight, Borndir did not hesitate. He threw himself in the path of the blow, taking the deep, gashing wound across his shoulder, meant for another. His sacrifice was a spark on tinder. His volunteers, enraged and heartbroken, fought with a ferocity that drove the orcs back into the crumbling streets. Their mission to secure the stone now fused with the need to save their leader. They loaded the heavy relic onto their boat, supporting Borndir as he bled, his silence more powerful than any speech. Back in Minas Tirith, the return of the wounded captain and the ancient stone could not be ignored. Cirion stood over Borndir's feverish form, his face a mask of conflicted stone. He saw the proof of an external enemy, the orcish threat he had always feared, and in that, he found a grim validation. He ordered the eastern borders reinforced, believing he was finally confronting the real danger. But he looked at the speaking stone, now resting in the courtyard, and saw only a rock. He attributed the attack to a mere border incursion, a failure of watchfulness, never connecting the shadow's precise strike to the profound symbolism of what Borndir had tried to reclaim. The true consequence, however, was etched on the faces of the volunteers. Borndir's blood, shed for a symbol of unity, had transformed their quiet hope into an unbreakable steel. They were no longer just followers. They were the living memory of a kingdom that refused to die quietly. The scent of kingsfoil and crushed athelas filled the small chamber, a sharp, clean fragrance cutting through the metallic odor of blood. Finduilas worked with a quiet urgency, her hands steady as she cleansed the deep gash on Borndir's shoulder. Her father stood apart, a silent statue, watching the evidence of his kingdom's decay manifest in the torn flesh of his most loyal captain. "This is the price of our silence," she said, her voice low but clear. "He bled for a stone, because the word of a steward is no longer enough to unite our people." She did not look at Cirion, but her words were aimed at his heart. He defended an idea of Gondor that you have let rust in this tower. A true leader's strength is not in commanding loyalty, but in earning it, in being seen to share the burdens of those he rules. Borndir, pale but lucid, turned his head on the pillow. His voice was a ragged whisper. "They did not fight for you, my lord. They fought for the memory of what we carried. For the hope that someone would listen again." In the strained face of his daughter and the broken body of his servant, Cirion finally saw a reflection of his own failure. A crack appeared in his icy resolve. He would try. He agreed to a simple, symbolic act, a ride through the lower circles of the city to show himself to the people. The morning of the ride, the sun felt like an accusation. Cirion, clad in his formal robes of office, descended from the citadel on his tall, gray horse. Finduilas rode at his side, her presence a quiet plea for grace. At first, a few hopeful faces turned upward, but as the procession moved through the bustling markets and cramped lanes, the chasm became a physical thing. Cirion's greetings were rehearsed lines from a state ceremony, delivered to the air above the people's heads. When a grimy-faced child darted forward to offer a wilted flower, the steward stared at the small hand as if it were a puzzling artifact. He accepted it with a stiff nod, his fingers never truly closing around the stem. The people bowed, as was customary, but their eyes were not filled with adoration or relief. They held a weary curiosity, the look one gives a portrait that has suddenly stepped out of its frame. They saw a king who had come down from the mountain, but who had brought the mountain's cold shadow with him. The ride was a performance of duty, utterly devoid of the humanity Borndir had shown in the fisher hut or Thorongil displayed at the fountain. For Cirion, it was a torment. He felt the distance he was meant to bridge yawning wider with every hollow exchange. He saw the flicker of disappointment in his daughter's eyes, and the cold truth settled in his soul, a truth far more frightening than any orcish blade. He wanted to connect. He felt the duty to connect, but the long years of isolation had built a wall within him that no single act of will could tear down. The people's tepid, polite response was not a rejection. It was a mirror, showing him the long and lonely road he would have to walk to find his way back to them. The first leaflet appeared nailed to the door of a baker's shop in the first circle. It was a crude but vicious caricature of Lord Cirion, his mouth stitched shut with thread, seated upon a throne that was little more than a skeletal frame. The text beneath was written in the common tongue, its words a poison-tipped dart. "Why does the steward not speak?" it asked. "Is it because his throne is built on the silence of his people?" The next morning, they were everywhere, tacked to market stalls, fluttering in the fountains they had worked so hard to repair, even scattered along the main thoroughfare. Each leaflet was a masterstroke of psychological warfare, not inventing new grievances, but weaponizing the existing despair Borndir had witnessed and Finduilas had tried to heal. They named the unnameable, calling him the silent steward, and his seat the hollow throne. The enemy was not launching arrows, but echoing the very doubts that had festered in the hearts of the citizens for years. The effect was not outrage, but a chilling, knowing murmur. The people read the words and found their own hidden thoughts staring back at them, validated by an outside voice. It was a mockery that felt like truth. Cirion's response was a study in predictable failure. He saw the leaflets not as a symptom of a deep spiritual sickness, but as a simple crime of sedition. His answer was the only one his isolated mind could conceive: more force. He doubled the city guard and imposed a harsh curfew, turning the streets into a patrolled prison after dark. The very patrols that were meant to provide security now became a symbol of oppression, their heavy footsteps, a constant reminder that the throne's only answer to dissent was to stifle it. This was precisely what the shadow in the east had calculated. By forcing Cirion to react with fear, the enemy made the steward himself an agent of the people's misery. The curfew stifled the fragile new life that had begun to stir in the city, killing the evening markets and silencing the conversations that had started to flow again. It proved the leaflets right. The throne was hollow, and its only voice was the clank of armor and the slam of a door. From his sict, Borndir heard the new silence descend and knew the battle was being lost without a single sword being drawn. But it was Thorongil who understood the final, grim implication. He stood at a high window, watching the empty, guarded streets below. Cirion's desperate grasp for control had not just failed, it had actively strengthened their enemy's position. The time for quiet rebuilding and symbolic gestures was passing. The shadow was speaking a language of brutal efficiency, and to answer it, one must be willing to speak back with equal force. A dangerous, decisive resolve hardened within him. If the steward would not, or could not, save the spirit of Gondor, then others would have to find a way, no matter the cost to tradition or protocol. Thorongil found the steward not in his throne room, but in the map chamber, its great parchment scrolls depicting a kingdom he ruled but no longer knew. The ranger's plea was stripped of all courtly decoration. "Lead your army to the borderlands yourself, my lord. Do not send a scroll or a lieutenant. Let your people see their steward standing shoulder to shoulder with the soldiers who defend their homes." A leader's presence on the field is a banner no enemy can tear down. It forges a loyalty that echoes for generations. Cirion's hand rested on the carved marble of Minas Tirith, his knuckles white. To leave the city would be seen as an act of desperation, he countered, his voice tight. It would show the enemy that we are stretched thin, that I fear for my own capital. My place is here, the unmoving center of the realm. His fear was a fortress, and he would not leave its walls. he gave the order to dispatch the 4th Legion, a formidable force, under the command of a stern and loyal general. It was a sound military decision, a move of pieces on a board, but it was a catastrophic failure of heart. The Legion marched out, a river of steel and discipline, but they marched without the spirit their steward's own presence could have ignited. They fought for a command, not for a king. Seeing the final door close, a profound shift occurred within Thorongil. He did not argue further. He simply bowed, a gesture of respect that felt like a farewell. In the quiet of his own quarters, he rolled a simple pack. His plans now turned north and east, toward the root of the shadow itself. If the throne would not become the symbol of Gondor's defiance, then he would have to find another way to rally its strength. His departure would not be an abandonment, but a pivot, a desperate gamble to confront the growing darkness at its source, believing completely now that the kingdom's salvation lay not in its hollow seat of power, but in the courage of those willing to act outside of it. The strange hum in the White Tower now had a voice. It was a sound of weeping, faint and ethereal, that seemed to seep from the very marble when the moon was high. Only a handful in the citadel could perceive it, a ghostly lament that left Finduilas sleepless and chilled. Driven by the sorrowful sound, she returned to the archives, her search now guided by a desperate need for understanding. In a forgotten codex of lore, bound in crumbling sealskin, she found it. The text spoke not of masonry, but of memory. It claimed the white stone of the city was not inert, but imbued with the spirit of the land itself, a living witness to the line of kings. When the throne sat empty for too long, when the ruler became a distant, silent figure, the stones began to grieve. The hum was their sorrow, and the weeping was their song of loss for a connection that had been severed. This was no superstition, it was a diagnosis. The kingdom was not just politically adrift, it was spiritually dying, and the very foundations of its greatest city were crying out in pain. She took the codex to her father, her hands trembling not with fear, but with a fragile hope that this tangible, ancient truth could finally break through his isolation. She found him staring from his window at the silent city below. "Father, the stone itself mourns," she said, her voice soft but urgent. "It is not a fault to be repaired by masons. It is a plea to be answered by a king." Lord Cirion turned, his eyes sweeping over the ancient pages without truly seeing them. He closed the book with a definitive thud. "These are the fancies of a bygone age," he stated, his voice flat and final. "The fears of simple men, given voice in old wives' tales. We rule with law and steel, not with whispers from the walls. I will not have my daughter chasing phantoms." In that moment, the last bridge between them collapsed into dust. His rejection was not merely of an idea, but of her insight, and of the soul of the kingdom she was trying to save. It was his ultimate refusal to listen, a final, deafening silence in the face of a spiritual truth that threatened the cold logic of his rule. As he turned back to the window, Finduilas understood that her father was now a part of the citadel's silence, another stone in its lonely, beautiful, and crumbling walls. With a quiet resolve that felt both terrible and necessary, she knew she could no longer look to the throne for salvation. If the stones were weeping, then she would have to find those who could still hear them. The weeping stones had spoken their final warning. Under a sky choked with stars, 3 figures met where the citadel's sculpted gardens gave way to the wilder shadows of the mountain. Finduilas, her face pale in the moonlight, stood beside Borndir, who leaned heavily on a staff, his shoulders still bound. Thorongil completed their triangle, his stillness more commanding than any gesture. They were a council of three, convened in the heart of a kingdom that no longer knew how to govern itself. The air was cold, and their breath misted as they spoke the words the steward would not. "We cannot wait for a command that will never come," Thorongil stated, his voice low. "The shadow moves while the throne deliberates. Our duty is to Gondor, not to its silence." This was not a debate, but an alignment of purpose, a pact forged from shared despair and a sliver of defiant hope. It was, by the strictest letter of the law, an act of treason. They were preparing to steer the ship of state, while its captain stared at a locked door. Their plan was a division of the very labor the throne had abandoned. Thorongil would ride east, not with a legion, but alone, a shadow slipping into the shadows to learn the enemy's true strength and intention. Borndir, once his strength returned, would travel not as a captain of the guard, but as a herald of the old ways, using the respect he had earned to rally the distant eastern fiefdoms, reminding them they were not forgotten. And Finduilas would remain in the White City, a quiet voice of reason in a court deafened by protocol, working to sway the few lords who still possessed a conscience. Each role carried its own profound risk. Thorongil faced the unspeakable dangers of the lands of shadow. Borndir risked being branded a rogue agent, hunted by the very patrols he once commanded. But for Finduilas, the danger was most intimate. Her work was a delicate, daily betrayal of her own father, a campaign of whispered persuasion conducted under the steward's own roof. Every conversation, every carefully planted seed of doubt, was a gamble that could see her exiled, or worse, witness the final shattering of the man she still, despite everything, loved. They parted without ceremony, three streams diverging in the night, each carrying a piece of Gondor's fading heart toward a desperate, uncertain future. The collision course was set. It was no longer a question of if their actions would be discovered, but when, and what the cost of their hope would be. The wind over the eastern plains carried the scent of wood smoke and strange spices. Thorongil moved through the tall grass like a shadow, his ranger cloak traded for the rough, spun wool of a wandering trader. He slipped into the Easterling encampment as dusk fell, just another anonymous face in the flickering firelight. The warriors spoke freely around their cook fires, their voices loud with a confidence bred from contempt. They did not speak of Gondor's armies or its high walls. They spoke of its silence. "It is their greatest weakness," one grizzled captain laughed, draining his cup. "Their steward rules from a tower of whispers. He hears nothing beyond his own fear." Another nodded, gesturing with a skewer of meat. "The outlying towns are ghosts waiting to be claimed." They have forgotten the sound of their own king's voice. Why should they fight for an empty throne? Thorongil listened, his face a careful mask of indifference, as the plan unfolded with chilling simplicity. They would not attack a fortified city. They would move south, down the Anduin, and fall upon the great port of Pelargir. The town's garrison had been stripped to bolster the northern borders, a decision made by a distant steward who saw the world on a map. Pelargir was rich, vital, and utterly undefended. The Easterlings saw it not as a conquest, but as a harvest. In that moment, crouched in the enemy's camp, Thorongil faced a choice that defined two kinds of leadership. One path led back to Minas Tirith, to the endless councils and the steward's slow, grinding bureaucracy. He could present his evidence, plead for the Fourth Legion to be redirected, and watch as precious days turned to weeks while Cirion deliberated. The other path was a solitary, desperate race south, a gamble against time and numbers. He knew, with a certainty that settled in his bones, that a report to the Citadel would be a death sentence for Pelargir. The throne would debate, and the town would burn. Without a second thought, he melted back into the darkness beyond the firelight. He found his horse, a sturdy beast of Rohan, and turned its head toward the river. His decision was made. He would not seek permission from a throne that had gone deaf. He would become the warning it failed to sound. The ride that followed was a legend in the making, a brutal test of endurance for both man and steed. He did not follow the safe, winding roads. He cut across country, fording streams and pushing through thickets, his eyes fixed on the southern stars. He rode through the day and through the night, stopping only when his horse was on the verge of collapse. He was no longer a captain in a foreign land. He was a force of nature, a single will acting where an entire government had failed. This was the starkest contrast to Cirion's inaction, a living lesson in the power of presence. While the steward fortified his silence in the White Tower, one man was throwing his entire being into the breach, becoming the voice and the shield for a people their ruler had abandoned. And as Thorongil raced against the dawn, the Easterling horde began its own, slower march, a tide of steel and purpose, flowing toward a town that slept, unaware its fate now rested on the speed of a single, unauthorized rider. Borndir found the heartland of Gondor sick with a quiet resignation. The villages were not burned, but they were broken. Fences sagged, fields lay choked with weeds, and the people moved with the slow, heavy gait of those who saw no future. He sought out the local headmen, the hereditary leaders who were supposed to be the throne's voice in these lands, and found only a deep, weary cynicism. Why should we send our sons to die for a city that does not know our names? One asked, his eyes hollow. Your steward's decrees are just more words on the wind. Borndir realized then that no symbol from the Citadel, no matter how ancient, could bridge this divide. The only thing that could was shared labor. He unfastened the silver star of his captain's rank and tucked it into his pack. The next morning, he went not to the headman's hall, but to the crumbled ruins of the old border watchtower on the hill. He did not command anyone to join him. He simply started working, hauling the heavy, fallen stones back into a semblance of order, his hands soon as raw and dirty as any farmer's. At first, the villagers watched from a distance, their suspicion a palpable wall. But as the days passed and the stranger continued his solitary, pointless task, their curiosity overcame their despair. One young man, shamed by the sight of a nobleman doing such work, brought him a water skin. Then another brought tools. Soon, a handful of them were working beside him, not as subjects for a captain, but as neighbors for a man called Borndir. They did not speak of loyalty to the throne. They spoke of securing their own homes, of protecting their families from the wolf packs and rogue bands that the steward's patrols never seemed to catch. As the tower slowly rose, so did their trust. The shared effort became a forge, and from it, a local militia was born, a grassroots defense bound by a common purpose they had built with their own hands. This was power earned through presence, a lesson the Citadel had long forgotten. But this very success became his greatest danger. The regional governor, a stern loyalist named Forlong, saw the gathering not as an act of patriotism, but of rebellion. A captain of the Citadel, operating without orders, raising a private army in the hinterlands. To the governor, it could only mean one thing: insurrection. He dispatched a troop of his own soldiers with orders to arrest Borndir for sedition. The news reached the village just ahead of the soldiers. Borndir stood before the men he had worked alongside, the choice stark before him. He could stand and fight, turning the people he had united against the very government he was trying to save, or he could vanish into the wilderness, becoming the fugitive the throne now believed him to be. With a heavy heart, he chose the latter. He slipped into the woods as the governor's troops marched into the village, their arrival shattering the fragile unity he had worked so hard to build. The conflict was no longer a war of words or whispered doubts. The steward's own law was now hunting the man who was trying to save its spirit, forcing the kingdom's protector into the shadows. The air in the throne room was thick with the silence of unspoken fear. Lords and advisors stood in their appointed places, a tableau of rigid loyalty, as Cirion prepared to hear another report on grain shortages. Before the clerk could speak, a new voice cut through the stillness. Finduilas stepped from the shadow of a great pillar, her simple gray dress a stark contrast to the court's finery. She did not look at her father, but at the assembled nobles, her gaze sweeping over them as she walked to the center of the marble floor. "My lords," she began, her voice clear and unwavering, "we gather in this room to speak of laws and logistics, but we have forgotten to listen to the two voices that matter most. The first is the voice of the people, who do not speak in petitions, but in the silence of their fields and the stillness of their workshops. The second is the voice of the stone beneath our very feet, which does not hum from a crack, but weeps from a broken heart." She turned then, finally, to face the steward on his dais. "Father, the kingdom is not a ledger to be balanced. It is a body, and it is dying of thirst. To rule from this height is to forget that the water of loyalty must flow both ways, or the land becomes a desert." For a single, suspended moment, the court was utterly still, every man holding his breath. Then Cirion stood, his face a mask of cold fury. "You speak of things you do not understand," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You breach the sanctity of this chamber with childish fancies. This is not your place." His command echoed in the vast space. "You will return to your chambers. You will remain there until you remember the duty of your station." The guards, their faces stricken with confusion and shame, moved to obey. As they escorted her from the room, Finduilas did not struggle. She walked with a dignity that made her father's rage seem small and petty. The closing of her chamber door was a sound that reverberated through the citadel, a final, definitive slam that did not just lock in a daughter, but locked out the last vestige of the kingdom's heart. In that moment, the last of the steward's moral authority shattered. The lords who had tolerated his isolation, who had justified his coldness as necessary strength, now saw it for what it was, a tyranny of fear directed even at his own blood. Finduilas Confinement became a symbol, a silent cry that echoed far louder than her words in the throne room ever could. Behind closed doors, in hushed conversations, the dissent that had been a whisper now found a name and a cause. The princess who dared to speak for the weeping stones was now their martyr, and her silent defiance became the rallying point for a resistance that the hollow throne could no longer ignore. The first easterling arrows darkened the sky over Pelargir like a swarm of locusts. Thorongil had arrived only hours before, his horse near death from the punishing ride, and found the great port slumbering in the false security of its own history. There was no time for formal command, only for action. He did not present credentials or demand authority. He simply started giving orders on the docks, his voice cutting through the panic with a clarity born of necessity. He organized the few retired soldiers and strong-backed dock workers into a shield wall at the main gate, using overturned carts and fishing nets to create choke points in the narrow streets. He inspired not with grand speeches of kingly glory, but with a fierce, practical hope. Fight for your homes, he shouted over the rising clamor of war horns, for the children hiding in the cellars behind you. Every alley we hold is another minute they have to live, and they fought. The townsfolk, who had felt the gray tide of indifference from their own capital, now found a stranger giving them a reason to stand. They fought with fishing gaffs and butchers' cleavers, their desperation forging a brittle but determined courage. Yet for every Easterling that fell, two more seemed to take his place. The defense was a dam about to break. Knowing the mathematics of the massacre to come, Thorongil ordered their last two swift riders to take the post road to Minas Tirith. Their message was not a request, but a stark reality. Pelargir burns. The enemy is at our throat. The throne must answer, or the kingdom loses its heart. That plea for aid found Lord Cirion in his map chamber, the parchment scroll of the southern fiefdoms laid bare before him. The rider, caked in dust and soot, delivered his message with the raw urgency of a man who had seen hell. And the steward hesitated. His mind became a prison of conflicting duties. To leave the White City, to march to war, felt like an admission that his entire philosophy of rule was a lie. It would show the enemy that the center could be moved, that the unmoving peak was, in fact, vulnerable. What if this was a feint, designed to draw him out so a greater force could strike the capital in his absence? The throne had not been empty for 1,000 years. Could he be the steward who abandoned it? He delayed. He called for confirmations, for scouts to verify the scale of the threat, for his generals to debate the logistics of a relief force. He treated a cry of existential crisis as a matter of bureaucratic process. His fear of being seen as weak made him incapable of the strength his people needed. Each hour of his deliberation was measured in blood spilled on the cobblestones of Pelargir. Thorongil's defenders, exhausted and bleeding, were pushed back from the main gate, then from the merchant square, making their last stand at the very quaysides. The fatal flaw of Sirion's reign was no longer an abstract concept discussed in hushed tones. It was a tangible force, as real as the Easterling scimitars hacking at the barricades. His power, wielded from a distance, had proven itself a phantom when presence was the only currency that mattered. The throne was secure in its silent hall, but the city that fed it was dying, and its steward was too afraid of the emptiness he had created to leave it. The report from Pelargir was a final, cold slap of reality, but the vision that followed was the true earthquake. As Cirion stood frozen over the maps, the ghost of Steward Belekthir seemed to step from the very tapestry on the wall, his face not angry, but etched with a profound and sorrowful disappointment. He did not speak of law or logistics. He pointed a translucent finger toward the south, and in that silent gesture, Cirion heard the screaming of his people and the weeping of the stones he had refused to hear. The ancestral gaze was a judgment that shattered the last of his pride. He saw his reign for what it was, a long and cowardly retreat from the very essence of his duty. In that shattering moment, he finally understood. A throne's power is not a shield to hide behind, but a standard to be carried into the fray. To be effective, power must be present. His voice, when it came, was a raw, unfamiliar thing, echoing in the silent chamber. "Saddle my horse," he commanded. "Assemble the royal guard. We ride for Pelargir." The order was an admission that his entire life's philosophy had been a catastrophic error. The news spread through the White City like a shockwave. When the great gate of the citadel swung open and the steward emerged, not in his robes of office, but in the polished mail of a field commander, a stunned silence fell over the watching crowds. They saw a man they did not recognize, his face stripped of its cold certainty, replaced by a grim and urgent purpose. He was not a statue descending from a plinth. He was a leader, finally answering a cry for help. And then, as he spurred his horse forward, the silence broke. It was not a polite murmur, but a roaring wave of cheers that seemed to shake the very foundations of the city. The sound was a physical force, a long-dammed river of hope, finally bursting free. For the first time in a generation, the people of Minas Tirith saw their ruler riding toward a fight, not away from one. It was a single, pivotal step on the long road back from the abyss, a journey to reclaim not just a city, but the very soul of his stewardship. The thunder of hooves on the cobblestones was the sound of a promise finally kept. Lord Cirion and his knights did not ride into a battle, but into a slaughterhouse. The air in Pelargir was thick with smoke and the coppery tang of blood. They found Thorongil and the last of the defenders backed against the stone quays, a shrinking ring of desperate men holding against a relentless tide of Easterlings. There was no time for strategy, only for salvation. Cirion did not take a command position at the rear. He drove his horse directly into the heart of the fray, his personal banner, the white tree of Gondor, cutting through the haze like a declaration. For the first time, his people did not see a distant steward on a cold throne. They saw a man, his face streaked with soot and fury, his sword ringing against enemy shields. His presence on the front line was an electric shock to the weary defenders. "That is our Lord," a cry went up, a voice raw with disbelief and sudden, blazing hope. "He is here with us." The tide did not just turn, it reversed with the force of a crashing wave. Soldiers who moments before had been fighting for their lives now fought for their king, their exhaustion burned away by a fury they had forgotten they possessed. They surged forward, a single, roaring entity, driving the invaders back from the quayside. In the chaotic press of the counterattack, an Easterling chieftain broke through the line, his axe aimed for Cirion's unguarded back. Borndir, who had fought his way to his steward's side from the moment he arrived, moved with the last of his strength. He threw himself into the path of the blow, taking the full force of the axe meant for Cirion. He fell at his steward's feet, his sacrifice a final, silent lesson in the loyalty that presence commands. The victory was complete, the Easterlings routed and driven into the river. but as the cheers of the surviving soldiers echoed over the bodies of the fallen, the cost was etched in Cirion's face as he knelt in the blood-soaked street, cradling the body of the captain who had never lost faith. This victory was not won by decrees from a white tower. It was purchased with shared blood and witness sacrifice, a brutal but necessary surgery to begin healing the rift between a ruler and his people. The hollow throne had been filled, not by a king's return, but by a steward's choice to finally stand with his own. The roar of victory was a hollow sound in Lord Cirion's ears. He stood on the blood-slick stones of the quay, the acrid smoke of battle stinging his eyes, his gaze fixed on the single, still form lying a few paces away. Borndir had fallen in the final moments, just as the last of the Easterlings broke and fled. It had not been a glorious sword stroke, but a common arrow, loosed from a dying man's bow on a nearby rooftop, its trajectory aimed squarely at the steward's heart. With a final, instinctual surge of loyalty, Borndir had stepped into its path. Now he lay breathing in shallow, ragged gasps, the dark feathered shaft standing from his chest. Cirion stumbled to his side, his own royal mail stained with the grime of the fight, and fell to his knees in the mud. The world narrowed to this patch of ground, to the face of the man who had never stopped believing in Gondor, even when its ruler had lost his way. Borondir's eyes fluttered open, their focus sharp and clear despite the pain. He did not speak of glory or duty. His voice was a whisper, each word a precious, labored breath. "My lord," he said, his hand weakly grasping Cirion's vambrace, "you have won the battle. Now you must win the peace. Do not return to the White Tower and close the doors." His grip tightened with a last, surprising strength. "Rule from among them, not above them. Let them see your face and know their king in you." The final breath left him not as a sigh, but as a settled silence. And in that silence, something in Cirion broke. The cold, disciplined shell he had cultivated for decades shattered. A sob, raw and unbidden, tore from his throat. He did not hide his face or turn away. He knelt there in the filth and the gore, his shoulders shaking, weeping openly for the captain, for the years wasted, for the silence he had imposed upon his kingdom. The soldiers who had cheered his arrival now stood in a silent, watchful circle. They did not see a weak leader. They saw a man humbled by sacrifice, grieving for a friend. They saw their steward, not as a distant symbol of power, but as a mortal being, brought to his knees by the ultimate cost of his own long absence. The tears washing tracks through the grime on his face were more powerful than any decree he had ever issued from the throne. In that moment of profound vulnerability, the old steward died, and a new one was born, forged in shared loss and baptized in the mud of a reclaimed city. He had finally come down from the mountain, and he would not be going back. The great bell of Minas Tirith began to toll, a single, heavy note that rolled down from the white peak and washed over the silent city. It was not a sound of victory, but of mourning. Lord Cirion did not ride through the gates at the head of a cheering column. He walked, his helm removed, his face etched with a grief he no longer tried to conceal. Before him, borne on a shield by his most honored knights, lay the body of Borndir, wrapped in the silver and sable of his service. The people did not cheer. They lined the streets, from the first gate to the seventh, standing in a silence more powerful than any roar of acclaim. They watched their steward walk among them, not as a distant ruler returning to his fortress, but as a man sharing his profoundest loss with the kingdom he had failed. This somber procession was the antithesis of his previous, stiff rides through the city. There was no protocol here, only the raw, unifying truth of sacrifice. Each toll of the bell was a hammer strike against the long silence, each note a public acknowledgement of a cost that could no longer be ignored. It was not a celebration of a battle won, but a communal funeral for the years of indifference. In that shared grief, a new sound began to fill the void, a low murmur of respect that flowed through the crowd, a wordless understanding that they were, finally, all part of the same story. The hollow echo of the throne room was being replaced by the resonant, living sound of a people and their ruler mourning together, the first difficult step toward a purpose renewed not by conquest, but by collective sorrow. He stood before the seat of his ancestors, but he did not climb the steps. The steward's chair, carved from a single pale trunk of Lebethrin, waited for him in the silent hall, but Lord Cirion remained on the level of the assembled court, his boots still dusted with the grime of the road. His gaze swept over the lords and ladies, their faces a mix of awe and apprehension, and then settled on his daughter, Finduilas, who stood near the archway, her own expression unreadable. The victory at Pelargir has shown me the truth of Borndir's final words, he began, his voice stronger and clearer than it had been in years. A throne is not a fortress for a ruler. It is a promise to the ruled, and that promise has been broken for too long. He turned and looked up at the empty seat. Until the king returns to claim his own, this chair will remain a symbol of our watch, not a seat of my power. From this day forward, I will not rule from this isolated peak. I will govern from the heart of our city, from the halls where our people gather, and in the streets where they live. The silence that followed was not the hollow silence of before. It was the stunned, breathless quiet of a foundation shifting. This was not a minor change in policy. It was a symbolic abdication of 1,000 years of tradition, a deliberate dismantling of the very power structure that had hollowed out the kingdom. He was declaring that true authority no longer resided in the stone of the chair, but in the presence of the steward among his citizens. Then he walked toward Finduilas, the eyes of the entire court upon him. He stopped before her, and for a long moment, the father and the daughter simply looked at one another, the chasm of their disagreements laid bare between them. "I have been deaf to the wisdom in my own house," he said, his voice softening. "You tried to show me the weeping stones, and I called them phantoms. You spoke for the people, and I called it treason. I ask not for your forgiveness, but for your counsel. Will you help me learn to listen?" Finduilas did not speak. She simply reached out and took his offered hand, her grip firm. The single gesture was a healing of the breach, a reconciliation more powerful than any royal decree. It was a commitment to a new way forward, a pact to honor Borndir's legacy, not with monuments, but with action. By choosing the city over the citadel, Cirion was finally answering the captain's sacrifice, transforming a hollow throne into a living promise, a vow that Gondor would be led not from a distant height, but from within the beating heart of its own people. The victory feast in the great hall was a tapestry of light and sound, a stark contrast to the somber procession that had preceded it. Yet the most pivotal conversation occurred not at the high table, but in a small, lamplit chamber where Cirion and Finduilas met with the ranger. Thorongil stood before them, the familiar vigor in his bearing now tempered by a profound and ancient gravity. He looked from the steward to his daughter, and the easy camaraderie of the campaign fell away, replaced by a formal solemnity. "The time has come for truth," he said, his voice resonant with a new weight. "I am not merely a captain of the Northern Rangers. My name is Aragorn, son of Arathorn, and I am the heir of Isildur, the last king of the line of Elendil." The air in the room grew still. Finduilas felt the words not as a shock, but as a deep and resonant confirmation, a key turning in a lock she had always sensed within the city's stones. Cirion stared, the revelation striking at the very core of his identity. The king he had stewarded for his entire life was standing before him, a man he had tried to relegate to a remote garrison. Aragorn saw the storm of emotions in the steward's eyes and spoke with a gentle firmness. "Your courage at Pelargir has set Gondor on the path to healing, a path it must walk to be worthy of a king. But my hour has not yet come. The shadow in the east gathers its strength for a final war, and I have other roads to travel, other peoples to unite. To claim the throne now would shatter this fragile renewal, turning your hard-won authority into a question of lineage and sparking the very discord our enemy craves." He placed a hand on Cirion's shoulder, a gesture of profound respect. "Your task is not to replace the king, but to prepare for him. Rule now as you have learned to rule, with a presence that mends the people's spirit. Make Gondor strong again in heart, so that when I return, I will not claim a hollow throne, but a kingdom restored to its purpose." This was not an abandonment, but a sacred pact. By choosing to depart, Aragorn was entrusting the entire future of the realm to the steward's transformed leadership, a final test of the lesson learned in blood and tears. He was securing an alliance not of parchment, but of shared hope, a promise that would echo through the coming dark times. For Cirion, the weight of the crown was lifted, replaced by the clearer, nobler weight of a steward's true duty. He was no longer a placeholder in a silent hall, but a guardian actively shaping a future worthy of his king. As Aragorn turned to leave, his gaze met Finduilas's, and in that silent exchange passed a world of understanding and a promise of return woven into the very fate of Middle-earth. The proclamation was read at every crossroads and carved into the plinth of the restored fountain. Lord Cirion named it the Oath of Ayanil, a binding vow for all who would follow him as steward. Henceforth, no ruler of Gondor would be permitted to remain forever within the white walls of the citadel. Each must spend one season of every year living and working anonymously among the people they were sworn to govern. A steward would mend nets with the fisher folk of the Aether, or swing a hammer with the stonemasons of the First Circle, or walk the furrows with the farmers of the Pelennor. The throne could no longer afford the luxury of deafness. This was the institutional answer to Borndir's sacrifice, a permanent cure for the disease of isolation. The old guard of the court was scandalized. They saw it as a dangerous erosion of majesty, a descent into commonness that would strip the stewards of their necessary aura of power. How can they command our armies if they are known to have clean stables? One lord scoffed in the High Council. This makes a mockery of centuries of tradition. But their voices were like the last gusts of a departing storm. The younger generation of knights and scribes, those who had witnessed the transformation at Pelargir and felt the stirring of a new hope, embraced the oath as their own. They saw in it not a loss of authority, but its redemption. To them, a leader who understood the weight of a plowshare or the mending of a fishing net would wield a far wiser and more resilient power than one who knew only the weight of a scepter. The first steward to undertake the journey was Cirion himself. He left his ring of office with his daughter and walked down from the citadel, dressed in the plain wool of a traveling merchant. For 3 months, he was simply another pair of hands, his true name and title a secret known only to a trusted few. He learned the price of seed grain, not from a ledger, but from the anxious conversations in a village market. He felt the weariness in the bones of a farmer at the end of a long day, and heard the unvarnished hopes of parents for their children, spoken without the filter of fear or ceremony. When he returned, his decrees were different. They were not just commands, but solutions forged in the shared reality of his people's lives. The Oath of Ayanil transformed the stewardship from a hollow authority into an engaged guardianship, ensuring that the voice of the people would forever be a whisper in the steward's ear, a constant reminder that true power is rooted not in stone, but in the soil of shared experience. The silence of the white stones was no longer a void, but a presence. Weeks after the proclamation of the new oath, as Syrian and Finduilas walked together through the lower circles, they realized the oppressive hum that had plagued the citadel for so long was simply gone. In its place was something new, a faint and harmonious resonance that seemed to breathe from the marble walls and the very flagstones beneath their feet. It was not a sound one heard with the ears alone, but a vibration felt in the soul, a quiet music of alignment. The stones, which had wept for an age, were now beginning to sing. This was the land itself acknowledging the healing of its spirit, a spiritual confirmation that the rift between the ruler and the realm was finally closing. Where the old vibration had been a dissonant cry of wrongness, this new resonance was a chord of profound peace, a testament to the restored connection that now flowed between the steward and his people. It was as if the kingdom itself was exhaling a breath it had held for 1,000 years, the ancient lament giving way to a quiet, hopeful hum of life rekindled. The rightness of their new path was no longer just a matter of policy or hope, but a tangible force resonating in the air, a silent symphony of a throne that had finally remembered its purpose was not to command from a distance, but to resonate in harmony with the hearts it was meant to serve. The first council did not convene in the echoing throne room, but under the open sky, its benches arranged in a wide circle around the very fountain Borondir's volunteers had brought back to life. The water's gentle murmur was the only music, a constant reminder of the shared labor that had made this moment possible. Representatives arrived from every corner of the realm, their faces a mixture of suspicion and fragile hope. There were farmers from Lothar with soil still under their nails, vintners from the southern vales, and grim-faced hunters from the foothills of the White Mountains. They had come expecting to speak to a wall of stone-faced officials, to have their words absorbed into the citadel's usual silence. What they found was Lord Cirion, seated not on a raised dais, but on the same simple stone bench as everyone else, a wax tablet and stylus resting on his knee. He did not open with a grand speech. He began with a simple question, his voice carrying clearly in the courtyard. What does Gondor need to hear from you today? One by one, they stood, a woman from the Weaving Guild spoke of the unfair tariffs that were strangling their trade. Cirion listened, asked a clarifying question about the price of raw wool, and then turned to his scribe. The tariff on raw materials for the guilds of the First Circle is hereby halved, effective with the next moon, he declared. The decree was written not on distant parchment, but on the spot, and read aloud to the assembly. A ripple of stunned disbelief moved through the crowd. A shepherd from the northern dales then spoke of the wolf packs that had grown bold without the royal hunters to cull them. Instead of ordering a report, Cirion looked to a captain of the rangers present. Take 20 men and the best hounds from the royal kennels. Go with this man, and do not return until his flocks can graze in peace. The captain, accustomed to weeks of bureaucratic delay, simply nodded, a new light of purpose in his eyes. This was governance in real time, a visible, tangible transfer of power from the isolated throne to the people it served. For every grievance, there was an immediate response, a decision made not in secret, but in the light of day, with the concerned parties looking on. The trust that had been eroded by years of silence could not be rebuilt in a day, but with each on-the-spot decree, with each attentive nod from their steward, a new foundation was laid, stone by patient stone. The council lasted from sunrise until the stars emerged, and when it ended, the people did not disperse quickly. They lingered by the flowing water, talking animatedly among themselves, their voices blending with the fountain's song in a new and hopeful harmony for the kingdom. The new memorial stood not in the silent halls of the dead, but in the bustling heart of the city's market square. It was not a statue of a stern captain in armor, but a life-sized figure of Borndir, seated on a simple bench, his head tilted in conversation as he offered a piece of bread to an unseen companion. The inscription carved into its base was not a list of battles or titles, but 3 simple words he reminded us to speak. This public tribute became a pilgrimage for the people of Gondor. Parents brought their children to touch the stone hand, telling them the story of the captain who sat in a fisher hut and listened. Lovers met there, merchants paused their haggling to reflect, and old soldiers would simply stand and remember. The memorial was a constant, living lesson in the city's center, a daily reminder that the authority which truly endures is the kind earned through shared humanity, not imposed by distant decree. It taught that leadership begins not with a command, but with a conversation. This stone testament to relationship began to shape a new generation. Young men and women entering the steward's service no longer aspired first to a high title or a place in the citadel. They sought postings in the far-flung villages, or roles that would bring them into direct contact with the citizens they served. They understood that their legitimacy would be measured not by the height of their office, but by the depth of their connection to the people. They became known as the listeners, and their influence slowly, surely, rewrote the old story of Gondor's power, proving that a legacy built on presence outshines any built on position alone. Years had softened his steps, but not the clarity in Lord Cirion's eyes. The White City was alive with a sound he had once forgotten, the vibrant hum of a community engaged in its own destiny. He walked through a market square where the stone figure of Borndir was now weathered by sun and rain, a familiar friend to the children who played around its base. One such child, a girl with curious eyes, broke from her friends and approached the old steward. She pointed a small finger up toward the peak of the citadel. "Why is the big chair in the tower always empty?" she asked. Cirion did not stand on ceremony. He knelt, bringing his gaze level with hers, the cobblestones cool beneath his knees. He thought of the cold stone he had touched a lifetime ago, of the reports he had dismissed, and the tears he had finally shed in the mud of Pelargir. "That chair is not meant to be filled by a person alone," he explained, his voice gentle. "A throne is hollow until the people's voices fill it. Its real power isn't in the one who sits there, but in the ones who are heard by the one who serves from it." He gestured to the bustling square around them, to the merchants, the guards, the parents calling their children home. Real strength, the kind that builds kingdoms that last, lies not in commanding from a height, but in listening from right here. The child considered this, her small brow furrowed in thought, and then she simply nodded, a profound acceptance of a truth it had taken him a lifetime to learn. In that simple exchange, his entire journey was complete. The isolated ruler had become the compassionate steward, and the kingdom's long, dangerous silence was forever broken, not by a king's return, but by the enduring music of a people who knew they would always be heard. Cirion's final years wove a new kind of legend into the tapestry of Gondor, one written not in grand edicts, but in quiet, shared moments. He became a familiar sight, the old steward walking the muddy lanes of the Pelennor fields, or sharing a noon meal in a soldier's barracks. His authority no longer a thing of proclamation, but of earned respect. The people did not bow with formal fear when he passed. They nodded with a recognition that spoke of a bond deeper than any oath. He had healed the land not by conquering its enemies, but by finally listening to its heart, and in doing so, he became more beloved than any king who had ruled from a cold and distant seat. When his time came, the mourning that swept through the city was a profound and personal grief, the loss of a father to the entire realm. The stewardship then passed to his daughter, Finduilas, a woman who had learned the cost of silence and the power of a single voice. She did not need to reinvent her father's work, only to deepen its roots. Under her guidance, the Oath of Ayanil became the unshakable foundation of Gondor's identity. The listeners, those young stewards who served among the people, became the kingdom's true strength. Their reports from the land, shaping a governance that was responsive, resilient, and deeply human. Finduilas ensured that the painful lesson of the hollow thrones was never forgotten, a cautionary tale etched into the very soul of their leadership. This was the legacy she guarded, a realm kept strong and united not for its own sake, but for a future hope. She prepared Gondor for the day its true king would return, not by building higher walls, but by forging a people whose collective will resonated with a single, clear purpose. The throne in the White Tower remained empty, but the kingdom it symbolized was now full, its silence forever broken by the enduring music of a people who knew, without a doubt, that they would always be heard.